A couple weeks ago, I talked about 19 players that I don't have on a single one of my 30 Dynasty teams. After posting that video, I got some requests for the opposite. People wanted to hear about my highest Dynasty exposures, the players that are going to make or break my 2025 season. So let's do it. My name is Paul. This is Pure Potential. If you enjoyed today's video, make sure to subscribe, like, leave a comment. Let's get into it. All right, just to review the important context here, I am in 30 Dynasty leagues. Assuming we use 12-team leagues as the standard, you should expect to have one share of a player for every 12 leagues that you're in. Like if you're just drafting at random rather than picking and choosing the guys you want, you'd have about 8.3% exposure. That's the baseline. So if you're in 30 leagues, that 8.3% number works out to about 2.5 shares of any given player. But every player in today's video is one that I have on at least 20% of my Dynasty teams, which works out to 6 shares, which is about 2.5 times more than the average at market position. Now, I've talked about a lot of these players in other videos this offseason. Obviously, if I'm high enough on a player to have that much exposure in Dynasty, I'm probably making content about them too. So to save some time and avoid repeating myself too much, I'm going to put a link to all of the videos that I talked about these players in the description, along with the names of the players discussed. So you can very quickly go and find a video where I gave a longer explanation of why I am in on a player at cost, why I'm high on their upside, whatever the case might be. Now we're going to go in descending order of startup ADP. So the first player today is the only first rounder on the list. And that's Brock Bowers, who's sitting right at that 20% threshold for me. The majority of my leagues are tight end premium. So I feel very good about my exposure to the Dynasty tight end one. In fact, I have him ranked as a top 5 asset in my Dynasty rankings, which are tight end premium by default. And I did acquire another share of Bowers recently to get me up to this number. It was a blockbuster deal. It was very hard giving up this much value, upside, and depth, but this is a case of practicing what I preach. I'm always looking to consolidate value around the most scarce assets I can, players with elite scoring ceilings that are valued at the top of their positions. And this really worked out for me because it was an auction league where I didn't really win as many of the top tier guys as I would have liked. So I was able to send Travis Hunter along with a first, 2 seconds, Trey Harris, Harold Fannin, DJ Giddens, and Will Shipley to get Brock Bowers. And we're starting with back-to-back Raiders here. Not sure how I should feel about that, but the next guy on my list by startup ADP is Ashton Jeanty at 20% once again. When I tank, I do it effectively. So the majority of my teams last year were competing, but the ones that weren't, I secured the 101 at a very high rate. I think all but one of my rebuilders got the first pick in the draft. And then I was able to add 1 or 2 more shares of Jeanty via trades, where I was consolidating assets, trying to trade up to the 101 or just trade for him outright after the rookie draft. I have Jeanty ranked back to back to back with Bijan Robinson and Jahmyr Gibbs in my rankings. But in my experience, he's just been much easier to acquire than those guys. And the startup ADP would bear that out because Bijan and Gibbs are both top 10 picks. Jeanty is sitting there in that early second round range. So on high value teams where I'm trying to consolidate around young elite players, there's only so many of those at the running back position. And again, Jeanty feels like one of the more accessible guys. Like I don't even really bother sending offers for Bijan or Gibbs a lot of the time. Unless they're on a team that is clearly going into a rebuild, you're just going to get shut down. Whereas the sort of unknown element with Jeanty, I think people are more willing to part with him. But I'm very eager to see him on the field. I think he's going to handle huge volume right away. I think he's going to be very, very good. And I think there's a very good chance he could be the Dynasty RB1 by the end of this season, just because of the age difference between him and the other top 2 guys. And then we have another second round startup pick in Trey McBride. Apparently, I really like elite tight ends. I think McBride is a solid value in tight end premium startups. I'm not opposed to drafting him where he goes, but thankfully I didn't have to pay full price for most of my shares of Trey McBride because I've held him in several leagues since his rookie season, where he was a second round rookie pick that plummeted to basically worthless after he got alphaed by Zach Ertz. And then even after last offseason, where he was coming off of a pretty good year, he was still available in the late 3rd or early 4th round of startups. But now, I think he has rightfully climbed up to that second round range. And while George Kittle's still in that elite tier for redraft, in Dynasty, there is an absolute chasm between Bowers and McBride and the rest of the position. There's just nobody that's even close right now. Maybe Tyler Warren can do it. Maybe Colson Loveland. Maybe Laporta can recapture the rookie magic. But right now it's those two guys and then it's everybody else. And so, these two guys, they're scarce assets. They can provide wide receiver 1 production at a position where most of your league mates are going to be settling for 11 or 12 points per game. So that's an advantage I want to get my hands on pretty much whenever I can in Dynasty. The first wide receiver that makes the cut today is Nico Collins, who I have in 23% of my Dynasty leagues. And the common theme on this list today, if there is one, is players that are the most acquirable in their tier. I talked about this with Genty versus Bijan and Gibbs. I think the same holds true for Nico Collins, where I'm always trying to add elite wide receivers when I can. And I've just found that Nico Collins is maybe a little bit undervalued relative to guys like Amon-Ra, Puka, Brian Thomas, so on and so forth. I do have him ranked behind those players, but I have him in the same tier, and I don't have him as far behind as the market seems to. I think Nico's capable of finishing as the wide receiver 1 this year. I think he should be a top 7 or 8 pick in redraft leagues. So that's an inefficiency worth attacking. I was buying him last year. I've continued buying him this offseason. He just keeps getting better and better, and he's tied to a good quarterback. I think it's wheels up for Nico Collins. I'm very happy to have him in all these leagues, and I just hope he can stay healthy for me. Now, if you're enjoying this video so far, make sure to subscribe to the channel so you don't miss any of my future Dynasty content. I've got new videos coming out each and every week. I'm going to have some recap of the preseason risers and fallers. I'm going to have a guide to rebuilding your Dynasty team if the season doesn't get off to the start you want. I'm going to have a video talking about how to make the best possible Dynasty trades in season. And, lots of other things as well. So you're not going to want to miss that. Make sure you're subscribed. And then if you want even more Dynasty content, especially in season, where it can be a lot to stay on top of movement between players, know who to buy and sell, consider becoming a YouTube member. You can hit that little plus sign on the subscribe button, or there's also a link in the description. And that's going to get you access to even more exclusive perks. There are private channels in the Pure Potential Discord where I talk Dynasty. I answer questions pretty much round the clock at this point. I do weekly live streams where we go over changes to the rankings, where we do mock drafts, where I answer member questions in depth. And you get access to my Dynasty rankings, which I think go over 250 players deep at this point. Every player is sorted into a tier by trade value, and those rankings are going to be updated every single week during the NFL season. So subscribe, check out the membership. Let's get back to the video here with Ladd McConkey, 23% exposure. I mostly acquired Ladd during rookie drafts and early last season before his production really caught up to his per route numbers. I think he's still very reasonably priced now at the 2-3 turn in startups. I've taken him there once or twice this offseason. He absolutely has the upside to justify the cost. I've never understood why some people think he lacks upside. He does basically everything at an elite level. He graded out extremely well in reception perception. He can play both in the slot and out wide. He plays with an elite quarterback, and he scored as a wide receiver 1 over the back half of last year. So I'm all in on Ladd McConkey in Dynasty. And then we've got Devon Achane, another 20%er for me, and probably the first player on the list where I'd actually like to lower this exposure a little bit. Don't get me wrong, I love the seasonal projection. If Tua stays healthy, and I guess if Achane can get healthy from whatever he picked up last week, I think he's got a legit chance to finish as the RB1 this year. But there's also just a lot of uncertainty around the Dolphins. We don't know if Tyreek Hill is good anymore. The offensive line is bad. Tua's a little bit fragile. Mike McDaniel's probably on his way out if the season doesn't go well. I don't think there's any massive risk of Achane getting replaced or going to zero or anything like that. But if there's a coaching change, if there's a regime change, maybe they do decide to bring in a new quarterback, I think his usage could be a little bit less creative, or it could just be scaled back a bit. So I wouldn't mind moving a couple shares into guys like Amari and Hampton, into Trevion Henderson, who, yeah, they're going to project worse this year, but there's also a little more long-term stability with those players. Our first quarterback today is Kyler Murray at 23%. I acquired most of my Kyler Murray bags after he tore his ACL in 2022. His value just plummeted that offseason. He's been a fine enough fantasy quarterback since then, but he hasn't really recaptured that 2020, 2021 form where he was a top 5 scorer. I think he's still a little undervalued as a late 4th round startup pick, so I haven't made a lot of effort to sell him, and I probably won't unless he really spikes in season. I think at his cost, I'm pretty comfortable to just ride it out with him as, low end QB1 type of guy and know that the floor is pretty high. And we'll follow that up with Dak Prescott, another guy that I have in 23% of my leagues. His value has fluctuated wildly over the past few seasons with some really high points and some extreme low points. His value obviously took a huge hit with the season ending injury last year, but he also has a very long track record of QB1 production. So I've been buying the dips for a while now. Whenever he falls past all the other reasonable starting quarterback options, I just buy Dak. And the result is I have him on a lot of teams. But I think with Lamb, Pickens, Ferguson, and a bunch of really terrible running backs in the backfield, I think the Cowboys are going to have one of the higher pass rates in the league. So I'm not too upset about this one. Now we have to go all the way down to Davante Adams as an 8th round startup pick to find my next 20% exposure player. And this lines up with what I've said in other videos like the startup guide, where I'm just not really pursuing a lot of those 5th, 6th, 7th round players. I don't think any of them stick out as massive targets in Dynasty, but I do like Davante Adams because I've talked about how hard it is to find elite wide receiver production outside of the early rounds in Dynasty. And I think Adams is one of those ways. Like even with pretty poor quarterback play last year and switching teams partway through the season, he still gave us 17 points per game in 2024. I think he's still a very, very good wide receiver. And now he's in one of the most condensed passing offenses in the league with the best quarterback play he's had since probably prime Aaron Rodgers. So if Matthew Stafford can stay healthy and Adams doesn't hit that dreaded age cliff, I think he can give us low-end wide receiver 1 production, even with Puka Nacua doing his thing. And so kind of an approach that I like is loading up my teams with safe, high-value assets at the top of the draft. And then once I'm getting into that round 8, round 9 range, I'm not so worried about the value floor as much as I am taking swings on players that I think can score a lot of points for me. That's how I try to get to that combination of high roster value, but also a good seasonal projection. And so it's just worked out that I've landed Davante Adams on a lot of my teams. Then we get to possibly the least surprising player on this list, which is Josh Downs. Maybe the most surprising thing is that I only have 23% exposure, but Downs has kind of been a my guy since early last year. He earns targets at an elite rate when he's on the field. He was top 5 in targets per out run last year. He's efficient on those targets. He's still very young. I think concerns about his situation, which were valid concerns to be fair, but I think they drove his price down too far earlier in the offseason where he was valued around like a mid-second round pick. And then we've seen reception perception come out. We've had a bunch of analysts kind of jump on the Josh Downs train and talk about how talented he is. And his price has started to rise. There's been a bit of a drumbeat. Now he did pick up a hamstring injury, but assuming he can get healthy, I think he's going to be a very useful asset with Daniel Jones under center and just kind of a safe investment where you know you're buying into the talent with Josh Downs. Our next player today is Tony Pollard at 20% exposure. This one kind of snuck up on me, but Pollard's just one of those cheap RB2 types that I tend to gravitate towards in startups or as trade targets, right there with James Conner, David Montgomery. He's just a logical fit for a lot of my teams because in those middle rounds where some people are chasing running backs like Kyron Williams, like James Cook, like Caleb Johnson, I'm typically going wide receiver there or quarterback or maybe even a tight end like Colson Loveland. And so when I get down into the round 10, round 11, round 12 range, I'm sometimes looking for my RB2 or maybe my RB3. And again, Pollard, Connor, Montgomery, those guys are just a good fit for that. That being said, I was actually trying to move a couple shares earlier this offseason because I had some concerns about Tajay Spears maybe being more involved and Tony Pollard being pretty inefficient as a receiving back. I didn't have any luck with that, which is why he's still on 20% of my teams. But now Tajay Spears is hurt. He has a high ankle sprain. And so I expect Pollard to at least start the season strong. I think they don't really have any viable backups on the roster, certainly not guys that can slide into a real pass catching role. And so I think it's going to be a lot of Tony Pollard for at least the first month or so of the season. And then maybe at that point, I look to flip a couple of shares to contending teams that need running back help. And then I try to backfill him with another option. With a guy like Pollard, where he is very fragile in the sense that he's a 28-year-old running back. He's not necessarily an elite talent. There's some question marks around his offense. It's not a guy I want to be super over my skis on, even if I do think his price is reasonable. And so more than likely, I will look to diversify from him early in the season. Now, some of my highest exposures come here in these later rounds where I start to care a little bit less about diversifying my picks and more about just picking out the guys that I think are clearly the best values. And one of those players is David Njoku, who I have on 27% of my teams. That's over 3 times that average number we talked about, 8.3%. I've been ahead on Njoku for a while now. I've called him out as a buy more than once. And it turns out I've drafted him in 3 of my last 5 startups, which is, I guess, how you get to 27%. But I think he's a great player. I think he's a great value in tight end premium, where he goes after Kyle Pitts, after Dalton Kincaid, a full round after Mark Andrews, and 3 whole rounds after TJ Hawkinson. The resume for Njoku is pretty impressive, especially given the team situations he's been in. He was the tight end 4 in points per game last year, and he wasn't all that efficient per route, but then again, nobody really was because they were throwing it like 50 times a game and all of the quarterbacks were terrible. But he did have an impressive 25% targets per out run. And with Joe Flacco named the week 1 starter, I think we could see those top 5 numbers from him again, at least until they inevitably turn to Shadur Sanders or Dylan Gabriel or whoever they do later in the season. But even if I only get, 10 games of top 5 production from David Njoku, I think he's been well worth the investment where he goes in the 10th round. Our third and final quarterback today is also the third Raider on the list and my highest exposure quarterback, which is Geno Smith. I have just genuinely never understood the price tag on Geno Smith. I think he's a legitimately great NFL quarterback, and I think you can find a lot of really intelligent analysts who will tell you the same thing. He turns 35 in October, but that's not that old for a quarterback. I think the expectation should still be that he plays for multiple more years. It's not like he has any chronic injury concerns or anything like that. And his contract with the Raiders locks him in for at least 2 years with a team option in 2027. I fully expect him to play out that deal. You look at what he's done in fantasy the last few seasons. He's finished as the QB 8, the QB 20, and the QB 15 in points per game, which is not like winning you a league, but it's also very usable. He's been inside of the top 24 all 3 years. He's been inside the top 10 at least once. And I think he's arguably in a better situation now than he was in Seattle. Certainly he doesn't have better wide receivers, but I think he's got a better offensive line. He's got Ashton Genty, who's a weapon out of the backfield. He's got Brock Bowers, who might as well be an elite wide receiver. Jacoby Myers is solid. And then, hopefully the team can get something out of Jack Bash and Deontay Thornton. But overall, I think this offense has a chance to be better than people expect. I think Geno Smith absolutely will be better than people expect. He's pretty much a lock for QB2 production. And I think there's low-end QB1 upside there as well. So at his QB28 price tag in the 11th round, he's just such an easy click. And it's like you can kind of push the other quarterback options in startups, or you can trade away quarterbacks off of your team, knowing that Geno Smith is there as kind of a safety blanket, a guy that you can break glass in case of emergency. And so I guess that's how I've gotten him on so many teams. Obviously, it's a little bit frightening to have that much tied up in one player just because there's injury risk and there's variance. But in general, I do think he's one of the more mispriced players in Dynasty. And from that angle, it makes sense to have such an aggressive position on him. Then we come to my highest exposure player of the day, which is Juwan Jennings, 33%. 1 out of every 3 Dynasty leagues has Juwan Jennings on it. You might not think that's that high of a number, and certainly some people do get more aggressive with their stances. They might be willing to go up to 40 or even 50% of one player. But when you're in this many leagues, it's actually pretty hard to get your exposures that high. And personally, I just prefer to diversify a bit because of the natural variance of the game, especially when it comes to injuries. Like, even if a player is just dramatically mispriced, there are still lots of outcomes where that doesn't pan out. So 33%, that's pretty much as high as I'm ever looking to go. I'm not going out and trying to buy more shares of Juwan Jennings. I would rather just go after somebody like Jacoby Myers or Michael Pittman in the same range that I don't have as much exposure to than add even more Juwan Jennings, especially right now because he is technically out with a calf injury, which might actually just be a contract dispute. But either way, he's not on the practice field. I'm sweating a little bit about that. Hopefully he comes back healthy. But as far as his play on the field, I've talked about him on this channel several times, dating back to last year. I compared him to DK Metcalf in a recent video. He's had an unusual journey in the NFL as a 7th round pick who didn't break out until year 5, but I do believe the breakout was genuine. He put up some pretty ridiculous efficiency metrics like 25% targets per out run, over 2 yards per out run, well over 2 yards per out run. This is like wide receiver one type usage that he was seeing for parts of last year. And the situation is not exactly the same now, but Debo is gone. Ayuk is going to miss like at least 6 games, and he might not be right at all this year. He had a lot of work done. We have no idea when he's going to be fully healthy. There's Ricky Pearsall for sure. There's George Kittle, but Jennings is going to be right there, and he plays a very fantasy-friendly role within the offense. And so this basically, it's very simple. I think a healthy Juwan Jennings is a near lock for wide receiver 2 production, and at wide receiver 53 prices, that's a pretty appealing investment. So it's one that I've made many, many times over last season and then this offseason. Now we just have 2 players left, and they're both tight ends. The first one is Dallas Goedert, who is another 20%er. He goes in the 14th round of startups. He was probably the most surprising name on this list for me when I went and checked my exposures. I guess just because he's not a player that occupies a lot of mental real estate in my mind, at least as a fantasy asset. But he just goes so late in startups, and he's genuinely a good player. And I'm not just saying that as a biased Eagles fan. He just is a good all-around player. He runs good routes. He's good after the catch. He's a good blocker. He doesn't leave the field a whole lot. In fact, this was kind of surprising. He's been a top 12 tight end in points per game for 6 straight seasons. He's never had that difference-making, league-winning type of season that I thought was possible when we moved on from Zach Ertz all those years ago. But yeah, I think he's a reasonable value. I understand why he's cheap. He's 30 years old. He's missed a lot of time with injuries, and he's competing for targets with A.J. Brown and Devonta Smith in a fairly low volume passing game. But with all that being said, I think he's still going to be a startable player this year. And there's also contingent upside. If either of the wide receivers gets hurt, more is going to be on his plate, because I don't think Jahan Dotson or John Mechie or whoever comes in for the injured wide receiver is going to command quite as much value. That's going to open up more opportunities for Dallas Goedert. And then the last player before my arbitrary round 15 cutoff is Harold Fannin, another 20%er and another Browns tight end. You might be thinking, how can you have so much faith and exposure in David Njoku while also being heavily invested in Harold Fannin? And quite simply, it's just a matter of cost. I think both players, individual, separate from each other, are both reasonable investments at cost. And Harold Fannin ended up being one of my most drafted rookies, which is not something that I expected. But he was a prolific producer in college. He got 3rd round draft capital. And outside of one heavy tight end premium league where I took him at the 301, I never had to take him before the middle of the 3rd round. I just thought that was too low of a price, even though I like Njoku. Just too low of a price. And for whatever it's worth, he seems pretty much penciled into a role from week 1. He actually sat with the starters in the most recent preseason game. Him and Dylan Sampson did. He's going to be on the field in 2 tight end sets. And I think he's also going to get some slot snaps in 11 personnel. The Browns do not have a clear-cut slot receiver. Harold Fannin, I think, is capable of that. I think his base role in this offense is going to be kind of similar to Isaiah Likely, where he's obviously not the primary tight end, but he can still get on the field a whole lot. Except the Browns are going to be a more pass-heavy team. And Fannin is just barely 21 years old. He turned 21 last month. So he's super young. He has time to improve. David Njoku's 29. He's not going to be there forever. And there's contingent upside. Njoku's missed time each of the last 2 years with injuries. Fannin can slide right into that tight end 1 role if and when that happens. So I just think he's been underpriced, and I've been happy to draft him when I've had the chance to. Anyway, that's going to do it for today, guys. I hope you enjoyed that little behind-the-scenes look at my Dynasty rosters. I'd love to know which name on the list today was the most surprising to you, which player wasn't featured that you thought might be there. Leave a comment down below. As always, thanks so much for watching the video. Thank you for supporting the channel. If you enjoy my Dynasty content and you want to see more of it in the future, make sure to subscribe to the channel. It really goes a long way. I'll be back soon with another Dynasty video, and I hope I'll see you then.